Imagination connoisseurs, sorry I'm a little late. I came to my computer and hit a button and it was doing an update. An update, I don't even know what. I think it was malware update for my Clam antiviral software. So it put the damper, it curtailed what I was trying to do. So I apologize for not being on time. Welcome to this, all of you members, all of you imagination connoisseurs. Welcome to this, the Post-Geek Singularity on a Memorial Day weekend. In America, it's a holiday where we remember all of the military, the men and the women of the military, and all who have served the country over the years, all branches of the service, everybody that has given their lives. My father was a World War II veteran. I mentioned today that he once flew on a plane with Douglas MacArthur. He did not see combat. He was actually stationed at a communications facility in Alaska. But he was still a veteran and spoke of his time in World War II. I wouldn't say fondly, but he did serve his country. And of course, as many of you know, I created, along with Dr. Michael Schertz, the crisis medicine, tactical casualty care video series with my good friend Mike Schertz, who is an 18 Delta, and he's a medical doctor. If you look up crisis medicine, go to the website. I highly recommend you look into it. And then the class, we created a 50-hour class. Very proud to have worked with my friend who was a veteran and worked actually with other veterans creating the series. So anyway, welcome. And today, it's interesting. The letters that I'm getting from people, and if you want to send me a letter, please do so at the Burnettwork.net. Go to the Burnettwork.net, send me a letter. The letters that I'm getting are beginning to define. Usually the letters you were writing are defining what's out there in the pop culture, the imagination connoisseur's zeitgeist. And I have a few letters, and of course, a great letter that I'm going to read from a longtime member of the Post-Geek Singularity community, one of your favorites, certainly one of my favorites. It's interesting to say people are my favorite people that I've never even met. I don't even know if I pass them on the street, I wouldn't know what they look like. I tend to identify people by their voices. You know, I love people's voices, all different kinds of voices. I don't even know what this person sounds like. But you know her, you love her. If you're a viewer, if you're a subscriber, and why aren't you a subscriber? My YouTube analytics tell me that half the people that watch me are not subscribers. Well, hit that subscribe button, because if I eventually hit 50,000 subscribers, I mean, I'm only at 11.5 right now or something. When I hit 50,000 subscribers, I have a big announcement to make, big plan that you're all going to be a part of, something that's never been done before, and it's going to take this. Actually, it's never been done before in the social media space. It's never actually been done in the world. But when I hit 50, I can't do it until I have 50,000 subscribers. And I figure hopefully that's my goal by the end of the year. I want to launch this thing that I'm doing in January of 2020. You will be witnesses, as Hans Gruber would say. This first letter, of course, comes from up north, from, once again, the great Willow Yang. Greetings, Rob. After all the discussion on Game of Thrones, Star Wars, and Star Trek these past few weeks, I found myself reflecting on fandoms and our everlasting conflict with studios over the handling of our favorite properties. I must say, we fans are a pretty elitist and entitled bunch at times, and I don't mean this as an insult to anyone, just an observation. We can be quite selfish and possessive. We always want our properties to be the way we envision them, and I'm very much guilty of that myself. I was severely disappointed with most of the Harry Potter movies when I first watched them. To me, the stories were bastardized, and much of the complexity and characterization from the source material sacrificed in order to create 2.5-hour films that were going to appeal to the non-book readers. I despised much of the alterations that were made, the omission of most of Dumbledore's shocking and tragic backstory, Barty Crouch and Beatrix Lestrange being reduced to deranged, mustache-twirling cartoons, the cringy added scene of Harry zipping up Ginny's dress. Even the Dursleys were done a disservice. I remember my friends and I getting up in arms when the first photos for the movie adaptation of Aragon were released. We were horrified to see that one of the main characters, the elf Arya, was blonde. when the novel clearly described her as having raven black hair. That's not who she is. They've ruined the character, we whined, even before seeing the movie. As it turns out, the color of Arya's hair was the least of our concerns. The movie was abysmal, and no amount of black hair dye would have saved it from the train wreck that it was. We like to believe that our franchises belong to us, that we're the customers who are supporting them with our dollars. But is that really true? How did Endgame have a $350 million opening weekend in North America alone? How much did the hardcore Marvel fans actually contribute to the 25 million or so tickets that had to be purchased to make up that sum? As Mr. Norman Lau stated in his letter a few weeks back, out of the 30 people at his workplace that purchased tickets to Endgame, only one, himself, was an actual geek. I don't know if this has been done, but I'd like to take a survey of the audiences that have watched Endgame. I'd like to know how many of them were comic book fans who spent months of their lives in anticipation, theorizing tirelessly over what was going to happen, and how many were just casual moviegoers, the so-called mundane, who just wanted to watch what appeared to be an exciting and entertaining superhero film. I suspect that the results will reveal that we're vastly outnumbered. Of course, we have a right to be critical. We should always be able to express our dissatisfaction whenever we feel some injustice has been done to our franchise. We should always be demanding better of our content. However, I do think we also need to remember that our opinions are only a few in a myriad. We are a minority, a very energetic, enthusiastic, and vocal minority, yes, but a minority nonetheless. And unless we are actually the ones putting up the billions of dollars that Marvel, Star Wars, and other properties are raking in, I'm not sure if we have the right to demand that our wants and needs be prioritized above those of the masses. Personally, I do actually feel a sense of gratitude towards the mundane. Without them, we probably wouldn't be receiving the volume of content that we are now. Star Wars and superhero movies aren't indie bands or novels. Albums and books don't cost hundreds of millions of dollars to make. Studios won't invest that amount of cash into a movie that isn't going to draw in the masses, nor should they. They are, after all, businesses, not charities. Endgame had a reported budget of over $350 million. Would this movie have ever been made if nobody but us, the geeks, were going out to watch the Marvel films? Finally, I would like to challenge the notion that the quality of our content has to depreciate as it becomes more mainstream. When we look at the comic book movie genre, many of the best films were made in the 21st century, when superhero movies have exploded into the global phenomenon that they are today. I myself once held a prejudice against the genre, dismissing it as hokey and immature, until The Dark Knight came out and obliterated my perceptions. We're now seeing movies like Logan and Black Panther receiving major awards recognition at the Oscars. Would that have been feasible 20 years ago? None of my friends are Marvel fans. They couldn't even remember Thanos' name. They just referred to him as the purple guy. Yet, they went out to see Endgame because they enjoyed the Marvel movies, but had no interest in watching Justice League because they hated Batman v Superman. I will contend that it is actually because comic book movies have improved in quality that the genre is now being embraced by a broader audience. Perhaps I'm just an optimist. But I really believe that the mundane are far more intelligent and sophisticated than we are willing to give them credit for. They might not be able to appreciate characterization in canon like we do, but they still desire quality content. The relationship between quality and popularity doesn't necessarily have to be antagonistic. It can just as easily be symbiotic. Yours sincerely, Willow. Once again, Willow Yang, in my estimation, knocks it out of the ballpark. Willow, you are absolutely correct in what you're saying here. And I think we as fans, we tend to forget that. We are, after all, first of all, as I've pointed out, in my mind, in my estimation, all of this entertainment is a luxury item. We take it for granted now because we've had it for so long. But for the most part, If you think about human history, if you're reading books like Sapiens and Homo Deus, and you're reading these things, and you realize most of human history was pretty much a shit show for everybody. It sucked. The fact that we're here today and that we're basically living in the best time humanity's ever known, it's pretty damn good. And the fact that we spend our days bitching about Star Trek like I do, Star Wars like Last Jedi like many people do, Game of Thrones like a lot of people do, we're bitching about entertainment that's being given to us in a grand fashion, on a grand scale, which we've never seen before. And in terms of human history, it's fairly new. Television has only been around since the late 40s, maybe. I mean, wasn't the first television broadcast from from the Olympics in the 30s from Berlin? So we live in pretty great times. I've always said that. We live in great times. And yet we're bitching and moaning, complaining all the time, which I understand. Look, my beloved Star Trek, it's got a spotty track record as much as I do love it. And fandom changes over time. I don't expect people are like, well, we can't expect it to look like it did in the 60s. Well, we can if you want to put it that way. It doesn't have to look like it looked in the 60s. The same way that I've said this before, but a World War II movie that was made in the 60s looks very different than, say, Saving Private Ryan did. Same armor, same uniforms, same war, but modern sensibilities in terms of how it was committed to film. But anyway, that I digress. I want to read another letter. This one comes from another person that's becoming one of my favorite letter writers or people that I receive comments and letters from. This comes from Paul in Long Beach. Morning, Rob, from a chilly Long Beach. It's true. I have a difficult time taking modern culture seriously. Social media has given rise to an outrage element that is undeniable. For the sake of this email, I won't get political, except to say that states in which are now attempting to curtail Roe v. Wade are doing so in order to troll the courts. They know the lower courts will rule against the law, even if the governor of Alabama admitted so upon signing. The goal is to have it in front of SCOTUS around the election 2020. The very definition of trolling. Since this isn't a political channel, though, we will focus on the modern geek culture and why so many folks are angry. Yes, I find it absurd if you spend one single second of your day to find an online petition to remake Game of Thrones, or release the Snyder Cut, or fire Brie Larson. In fact, just this morning, a channel you support is accusing Disney of targeting his family. I was unaware of this. A paranoid delusion that, thanks to YouTube, he is able to monetize. Make no mistake, so long as there is profit in complaining, it will never stop. The absurdity of it all to me is that outraged sellers scream and yell at people who make pretend for a living. Another YouTube recommendations headline for me this week was "A Force Scene Ruined Endgame." Loud, audible sigh. For me, the first realization of this was when another movie reviewer, who shall remain nameless, went after John Campia's wife in order to justify an unpopular opinion. It's only gotten worse. Just ask Kelly Marie Tran. I can't help but remember Schnepp and his sniveling character. Whenever I hear this claptrap, I laugh. But I wonder just how pissed the big guy would be in the long run at the whiners. Oh, he didn't have much tolerance for them. In conclusion, and to get back to my less than normal output, I'd like your audience to know that at the end of the Picard teaser, I half expected Orson Welles to arrive and say, "We will sell no wine before it's time." You might have to explain that joke to the kids. Cheers, Paul. P.S. The Hot Zone is tonight. Don't forget. Well, first of all, Paul, oh my God, I forgot. I read The Hot Zone. I read Richard Preston's book, The Hot Zone, which was about an Ebola outbreak at a facility very close to the White House, USAMRIID facility. Look, as I've told people before, I will read anything about disease vectoring, anything about plagues, viral outbreaks of any kind. I love them. I love any story about any of those things. I don't know why. one of my favorites was the third pandemic, where an actual developing disease, a mutating disease, was almost a character in the book. It was fantastic by Pierre Ouellette. Yeah, I've been reading Plague books, so I can't wait to see The Hot Zone. I hope it's great. That book was terrifying. Ridley Scott was going to make it into a movie once. Richard Preston also wrote a fictional book called The Cobra Event. There was also a great book called Deadly Feasts that was all about bovine spongiform encephalopathy, or Jakob Creutzfeldt disease, better known as mad cow disease. That was a terrifying book too. But the prognostications of that author, how mad cow disease was going to rip across the UK, never really came to pass, or at least it didn't come to pass yet. But I really like prion-based illnesses as far as illnesses go, because they're really scary. Anyway, I digress. But the complaining and bitching and moaning is part of fan culture. And I, too, have been guilty of it. But I don't get angry. Look, I don't understand why people don't like girls, women and things. I don't get it. I've always liked female characters. I've never had a problem with strong, powerful women. I worked for them in the studio system right after I worked on Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3. I say, bring on the girls. I don't understand why anyone would possibly have a problem with them. Never understood it. And why wouldn't you want? I mean, I spent my life, as I said, wanting girls in the fan space. Now they're here. Awesome. It's all good. Comic-Con is far more interesting than it was the first time I went to Comic-Con in 1988. So that's all I have to say. Bring on everybody. But the fan outrage is interesting. And I guess I understand it. And I can only use myself as a case study about Star Trek. And what was interesting to me is my fandom began with Star Trek. And when I was a kid, the idea that I would ever be mad at Star Trek or angry with anything Star Trek did was so strong that I would never have conceived of it as a kid. So as I've told people, when Star Trek went into strip syndication in 1972, I was 5. I apparently started watching Star Trek. That's what my mom tells me. And I became a huge fan. I loved everything to do with Star Trek. Even when somebody would bring me a toy, I never had that stupid helmet that said Mr. Spock on it with the red. I mean, I'd get those little discs, those guns that fired the discs. Star Trek phaser. Clearly wasn't a Star Trek phaser. It wasn't as cool as a Star Trek phaser, but it fired discs and had the name Star Trek on it. So, I would buy it. And I loved Star Trek, and I would. My dad bought me James Blish's novelizations or adaptations of the episodes. Star Trek 1, Star Trek. Well, the first time I bought the first Blish Star Trek was just called Star Trek. Then it was Star Trek 2, Star Trek 3, Star Trek 4, and all the way up to Star Trek 12. And then, of course, he wrote his novel Spock Must Die, and then there was Spock Messiah, and then all the Bantam books like The Starless World and The Galactic Whirlpool. Then the photo novels came out, then the animated series, the adaptation of the animated series that Alan Dean Foster wrote, which were actually very, very good. Everything that was Star Trek, all the way up to, I would say, there was never a time when Star Trek made me angry, let me down in my young life. On the cusp of becoming a teenager at 13, Star Trek the Motion Picture came out, blew my mind. I loved it. I was so enchanted by Star Trek the Motion Picture. It's still my favorite of the Star Trek movies. I had no idea what disappointment was in my fandom really until 1984 and Star Trek 3, The Search for Spock. I thought Star Trek 3, The Search for Spock, I had read Harv Bennett's original outline for Star Trek 3, which was called Return to Genesis, which was a pretty heady outline. And in it, Vulcan wanted to secede from the Federation, an idea that came up again in Diane Duane's book Spock's World. It was an idea I wanted to explore in the Axanar fan film that I was working on, because Vulcan, the revelation that the Genesis device was real was a monstrous one, and they were pissed. And in Harv Bennett's version of Return to Genesis, Kirk and company go back to Vulcan, which is being torn apart politically, and they want to secede, and that's where Spock I mean, that's where Kirk and Sarek hooked up, and the Romulans were the ones that snuck across and went to the Genesis planet, which had dilithium built into the matrix. So they began a mining operation on the Genesis planet. Of course, Spock, the newly reborn Spock, was picking off the mining team one by one. The feral Spock was killing them. I don't remember if he was resorting to cannibalism, but it wasn't good. But the story was pretty epic. It had political ramifications. It had Romulans, and to this day, that's why there's a Klingon bird of prey in Star Trek 3. And it made me really, really angry because I'm sure that it was decided at the 11th hour to make the adversaries Klingons, which to this day, everybody who is not that familiar with Star Trek always wants to default to the Klingons and make them the primary antagonists, which is, to my mind, very lowbrow and rather galling. So the rest of Star Trek 3 was Leonard Nimoy's first at-bat directing, and there were so many choices in Star Trek 3 that were made that, to me, were lackluster. And the film looks cheap, other than ILM, the effects. A lot of the Genesis Planet stuff was really not much more than a television episode when they're on the surface of the planet. There's a lot of things about Star Trek 3 I didn't like. And it was the first time that I remember sitting in actually it wasn't, it was the second time. The first time was Star Wars Return of the Jedi. That was really the first time. But Star Wars, it was only the third movie. But Star Trek had the episodes, they had 2 feature films. And I had internalized Star Trek so much as a kid, with the blueprints, the Franz Joseph Technical Manual, the Star Trek Spaceflight Chronology, Star Trek Maps, all of the novels, the Marvel comics, the Gold Key comics, as god-awful as those were. I never took them seriously, but I still liked them. I mean, there was so much Star Trek that was, my Star Trek-addled brain was full of Star Trek. And the first time I ever saw something that I remember being disappointed by, and even when I was watching Star Trek as a kid, I just loved all Star Trek. I wasn't so discerning. I mean, I didn't know why I didn't like episodes like, for instance, in the 3rd season, The Empath, which I actually really like now. I hated Plato's Stepchildren, even as a kid, because it was boring, and it seemed like it was about classical literature, even though it wasn't, but it kind of felt that way. The Platonians, and of course, and The Children Shall Lead. I even liked Spock's brain. I thought it was goofy, but come on, the ladies in that episode, the givers of pain and delight. I was never disappointed by Star Trek until Star Trek 3. And I remember thinking to myself, I didn't understand. Here was Leonard Nimoy directing this film. And I later realized that a lot of the things that I don't like about Star Trek 3 were directorial decisions that he could have alleviated. But actors don't always know as much about these properties as you would think that they do. They don't understand them holistically the way that fans understand them. They understand them from their experience as being an actor, but they're not the audience members. The mythology of the show is not something actors are dealing with. Actors are dealing with their lines. As Brent Spiner explained to me, as they figured out ways to allow the cast members in Next Generation only show up a couple days of the week at work, as opposed to every day, as they moved later on into the series, it was very welcome for them, and they would know their lines on the pages they were supposed to deliver them, but they weren't necessarily reading full scripts. Believe it or not, you'd think that they would, but why would they? They're there to do their job. Their job is to say their lines. Their lines might only be 1 or 2 pages in an episode, then they might be 40 pages in an episode. But actors aren't always the best people to understand why a fan base even exists, which is why when actors get intimately involved in the creation of that franchise, it can become problematic. Now, sometimes it isn't as problematic as other times, which is why hope springs eternal for the Picard series. But I would suggest to everybody look up Michael Pillar's book on the writing of Star Trek Insurrection, which is a fascinating book that anybody interested in television or movie writing should read, because it has a lot to say. So anyway, the people that are making this stuff, they have very different concerns from we who are watching and consuming it. Their concerns are budget and schedule. They never have enough time. Their great enemy, as Malcolm McDowell said in what I think is an abysmal film, but it has good moments, Star Trek Generations, time is the fire in which we burn. Nothing is truer when it comes to making television or movies. There's never enough time to get it right. and you're trying to make it the best that you can. Now, when you're working on a TV show that has a long legacy like Star Trek does, you try and honor that because people are aware when they come work on Star Trek that there is a continuum of Star Trek that previously exists. As I've maintained with the Bad Robot Star Trek, what they wanted to do was remake Star Trek in their own image, starting with Star Trek '09. They came up with a weird gimmick, an interesting gimmick, this alternate universe, alternate timeline gimmick that what was interesting about it was it sounds like a great idea till all you want to do is, instead of creating your own version of Star Trek, you go back and mine previous versions of Star Trek, like, oh, let's bring back Khan, Nooney, and Singh because everybody loves Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. You have an opportunity instead to create your own new movie, new antagonists, new adventures. But no. Let's go back to the well, which I don't understand. One of the things I learned in working on Star Trek, The Next Generations, the documentaries, where there was a concerted effort, although DeForest Kelley appeared in Encounter at Farpoint, there was a concerted effort to create a new identity. And while they did The Naked Now, for the most part, Star Trek The Next Generation, up until the third season episode Sarek, really went in its own direction. They kept the Star Trek format, but they tried to do things that were new. Forge New Ground, and by Michael Pillar's arrival for season 3, they were able to figure out that rather than deal with an external threat, that each one of our episodes should be about and focus on our characters first. So it was always, you go from our characters and their story outward as opposed to externally, and then come inward. That's what Michael Pillar's real contribution to Star Trek was. And he really, if without that shift in the third season, who knows where it would have been. So, but I understand as somebody who is completely invested in this day and age, so much of our time, because we're not hunter-gatherers anymore. We don't spend our days looking for a meal because we have refrigerators. We don't worry about predators, usually, depending on the neighborhood you live in. You don't worry about predators eating you or running away from somebody on the African veldt or whatever. We're pretty secure for the most part, especially in the West. We don't have to worry about these things. So we have an inordinate amount of leisure time, more leisure time than probably any time in human history. So what better way to use our leisure time than to get involved in fandom? And the funny thing is, this is always the funny thing. We become fans because we love something so much. We love it so much, and we love everything about it. We love the creators, we love the characters, we love the stories, and we don't just think about these things when we sit down and consume them. We think about them like, I used to daydream about living on the Enterprise. Like, I was at school and I'm like in math class, bored to tears, or in music class, bored to tears. And this was a different time than when I got thrown out of music class, and my book, Lucifer's Hammer by Jerry Pornell and Larry Niven, got confiscated because I was reading it in my 6th grade music class. That sucked. But we spend a long time pondering, as fans, pondering these things. We build model kits, we collect action figures, we dream up meeting these people. What would it like to be living in, say, Westeros? We think these. So part of our experience living in the world today is our imaginations. And we're thinking to ourselves, what would it be like to actually not just be fans of these things, but actually be a part of them for real? I mean, I think I've watched a number of YouTube videos about people that have gone to see Star Wars Galaxy's Edge or Star Wars Land at Disneyland, which opens Friday, I believe. People who've gone early are all blown away by just how immersive it really is and how it really feels. And it's a departure from what Disneyland did before, for all these Disney files. When you go to Disneyland, you're always aware that you're in Disneyland and the different lands, whether you're in Tomorrowland, whether you're in Fantasyland, Frontierland, whether you're in New Orleans Square, wherever you are in Disneyland, you're always keenly aware that you're in Disneyland. Well, what they've done that's different with Star Wars Galaxy's Edge is they've made it completely immersive. They don't mention Disneyland. Apparently, even the products you buy, although I don't know if this is true, don't break the fourth wall. The whole point is to create, it's the most immersive environment that's ever been created at a Disney park, in the sense that they try and make you forget you're in Disneyland, and the whole experience is you walk into Batuu, the planet at the edge, at Galaxy's Edge. which in my way of thinking, that's exactly what the fandom wants. You want that immersive experience when you go and play MMORPGs on online. I mean, why did people play World of Warcraft? Why did people play before that? Why did people get into Boot Hill and Traveler and Dungeons and Dragons? I mean, you want to have this immersive experience, and that experience is defined by our experience in the real world. We're taking our real world experience into our fandom with us. So we know if characters don't act correctly, or things don't look right or feel right, or they're trying to go against the grain of previously established lore, it becomes difficult to accept because we as fans know that's wrong. Which, on one hand, I'm thinking to myself, well, I've reached sort of middle age, or maybe beyond middle age, one foot in the grave. My life is filled with the conundrum. Maybe it's an unanswerable question. Can fans be, with our Star Wars is 42 years old. Star Trek is 53 years old. Doctor Who is even older than that. So is James Bond. Harry Potter is a relatively new franchise, but we're approaching what, the 20th anniversary, close to the 20th anniversary of the film franchise. So these franchises are long term now, and people grow up and they internalize them, and they're part of our civilization. They're part of our imaginations. They're part of our lives. They're literally a part of our lives. And then what happens is, unfortunately, all of these things need vast amounts of money to continue getting made. And so the very thing that we love, its existence is dependent upon as many people watching it as possible, which means our fandoms that began as niche things have now exploded into what? The post-geek singularity. So as Willow so astutely pointed out in her letter, it's the mundanes, to use that sci-fi term, or Norman's term. The mundanes are the ones that are actually supporting and keeping our franchises alive, not the fans. And that is, I think, the great irony of being a fan, is that we are the ones that know best, but the things that we love the most are no longer being made for their own sake. They're now being made as money-making machines for the corporate overlords that now own them. Star Trek was revitalized in 2009 by a company whose mandate was to make Star Trek mainstream. I would maintain that Star Trek will never be mainstream. They're trying to make it mainstream. Star Trek Discovery, they want it to be mainstream. Star Trek Picard, obviously mainstream. These animated series, they want to be mainstream. I think it's odd because I don't think Star Trek will ever be mainstream. It just, at least true, pure Star Trek. So what we're watching, at least with the Star Trek franchise, is it's being altered and changed to be something else. Now, in my mind, I get angry with it because they're being disingenuous. I feel like I'm being lied to. Not the government's not lying, but Paramount and CBS, everyone's lying to us, lying to Star Trek fans. If they just came up and said, look, they just made an announcement and said Star Trek in 2009, when Star Trek 09 was coming out, I had to endure J.J. Abrams saying in any interview, go back and look, I was never a Star Trek fan. I always liked Star Wars. And here's the guy that was now in charge of Star Trek. It was galling. It made me angry. I would get pissed off. I'm like, why then? And then he would defer to, well, Alex Kurtzman, and then Bob Orsi is the real fan, so he knows what's up. But even Bob Orsi, kind of like Kirsten Beyer, who is now working on Picard, who was on the Discovery series, here she probably got a dream job after writing some of the best. You know who made me care about Voyager? Kirsten Beyer did. The writer who is now on Picard, who basically came up with the idea of the Picard series. She made me like Voyager again through her novels. I went back and I started going back to watch Voyager episodes because of her Star Trek novels, because of her love of Star Trek, which is inherent on every page that she ever wrote. Go back and read her Star Trek novels because they're great. But if they just come out and said, look, we're going to reinvent the Star Trek franchise and make it for the masses, make it for, we need Star Trek to appeal on a global level because it's never traveled well, and just come out and say it. Like, just come out and say Star Trek Discovery, if you're going to go back and play with that timeline. Now, I've actually asked Brian Fuller point blank, Were you told that you had to be 25% different? Were you told anything about that when you first started the show? His answer to me was no. Nope. No one told him anything about that. No one told him anything about, oh, it has to be 25% different. He was just trying to make a canonical show, but update it, but still show respect and honor the original and try and keep it loosely within canon. That was his job. That's what he wanted to do. But what he wanted to do was he wanted to put a magnifying glass up to the Star Trek universe in such a way that it had never been done before. And yes, it was his original conception that there was the mirror universe. There was no spore drive. And all that came out was later. But clearly, if they just come out and said at the beginning, like, okay, beginning in 2009, we're going to revamp what is Star Trek. You now have from 1966 to 2005, and that's your Star Trek universe. That's a closed universe. We're no longer working in that, let's call it the canonical Star Trek. Let's call it the canonical universe. That's the canonical Star Trek universe. This new Star Trek will be informed by that Star Trek, but this is a new vision, a new look. And what's interesting is, as an anime fan, I'm used to this. Gundam, there's the Universal Century continuity, and we all know that when a Universal Century continuity work, like say Gundam Unicorn comes out, or Gundam The Origin is dealing with the UC. But then they've done many different Turn A Gundam, or they do Gundam Wing or Gundam Seed. Those things are not in the Gundam, the regular Gundam continuity, but they're examinations of the Gundam concept with a different lens. Now, if somebody just came out and said, yes, we are going to take Star Trek. We are going to start fresh. It's going to be informed by canonical Star Trek, but we're going to basically start anew and re-examine the concept of Star Trek from a different way, a different angle. Bring it on. I would have loved that. I even wrote one of my 3 Tumblr posts ever about what I would do with Star Trek. And I said that exact same thing. Reboot it. Start over. But they believe that the brand recognition is Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, because that's what sells, because that's what's been around, because they haven't made anything. Oh, wait, they did with Next Generation, so now we're going to get the Picard series. But even the Picard series is not going to show canonical fealty to the canonical Star Trek, to Next Generation. It's going to be based off of what Kurtzman and Orsi came up with the Countdown comic and Star Trek 09. It's a sequel to Star Trek 09. It really is, and to everything surrounding Star Trek 09. Now, I don't necessarily have a problem with that. That's why the Picard series is going to be much more palatable to me, at least I think so, because I know that while they're using Jean-Luc Picard, it is not canonically connected to Next Generation. It's a new examination of the character of Captain Picard by new creators. I have no problem with that. But just say that. Just come out. I mean, as an anime fan, I've watched anime reboots. As much as I like Space Battleship Yamato, or we know it as Star Blazers, I think Space Battleship Yamato 2199 and now 2202 is actually better, because they've taken everything that was good from Star Blazers, which was already a great, very groundbreaking show in the 70s, and updated it and made it awesome. They've retold that story. They've retold the Iskandar story. They've retold the Common Empire story, and they're doing a great job. They've updated it. They've made it modern. They changed some of the mecha designs to be more palatable. It's really great. It's really great. So just come out and say they've been playing these canonical shenanigans with Star Trek from the get-go. So they create this alternate universe. So they acknowledge canon is a problem, but the Spock that shows up in Star Trek 09 is not Spock from canonical Star Trek. He's Leonard Nimoy playing their version of Spock. But anyway, so I always digress into my Star Trek fandom, but I do think what we expect is that whether it's canonical or not, what we're looking for is, as always, great stories well told. That's what we want. We want great stories well told. That's all we're interested in finding as fans. So look, you can nitpick Star Wars all you want, but the original Star Wars, which was called Star Wars until 1981, so for 4 years of my life, it was Star Wars. Then it changed to Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope. But I'll never consider it's Star Wars in my mind. And Star Wars and Empire Strikes Back are in my young life two of the greatest things I ever saw. I mean, they worked beautifully well. They expanded the mythology. At first, a science fiction space fairy tale, which was done so well. As I said on my remembrance on Saturday, how important it was, how perfect it was, and Empire just took it to the next level. But those stories were so compelling, and like all the great stories, they draw you in and they feel real. Characters act in what seems to be a realistic fashion based on the input of what's going on, and all of us are able to discern whether a story is true or not, true to itself. I do feel like the 8th season of Game of Thrones, especially when you go back and you watch old episodes of Game of Thrones. When I say, the seasons 1, 2, and 3, and 4 to a certain extent, it was a character show. It was a show where people are talking in rooms, and the epic nature of the show came at the personal stakes that these characters they're up to their heads in all kinds of personal stakes, and the great drama in Game of Thrones came from those personal stakes. It was all character interplay, and then the conflagrations would come in episode 9, and they were externalizations of the internal character interplay and that we were seeing in rooms, and it would break forth into gigantic battles and things like that. Whereas I think mostly season 8, it was really just a few episodes in season 8, didn't get into the interiors of our characters, which is what Game of Thrones did, and instead gave us these grand sweeping exteriors, externalizations that weren't nearly as satisfying. You might like season 8 of Game of Thrones, and I like some of it, but I watched one clip of Tyrion Lannister talking to Tywin when Tywin says, "I spared your life. I wanted to throw you into the ocean, and you're a Lannister." And he walks off, and Tyrion's standing there and realizes his father, in his own way, did love him and did save his life. And it was epic. It was as epic as the dragon, as burning up all of King's Landing. And yet it was two men in a room talking. And it was just as epic as anything they're going to give you from a I don't know, whatever you call it. When you see a city being strafed by a dragon, or you see the green, you see the Battle of the Blackwater when Bronn fires the arrow that lights up the all the green fire and blows up all of Stannis' fleet. Not all of it. Two guys in a room could be just as epic as that. And that's what Game of Thrones was all about. And I think the real disappointment, and I don't think it's misplaced disappointment, in what happened, is that it was all external, and all of those conflicts that we came to know and love about Game of Thrones, they went in a different direction. Now, here's the thing. On one hand, I'm like, yeah, it's great that we got Game of Thrones. It's great that we're getting the MCU. I looked at Captain Marvel as, first of all, because I've loved the MCU for the most part, even when they made missteps like Thor: The Dark World or Iron Man 2, which are much better movies than people tend to give them credit for, but they've changed. They know what works and what doesn't. So when I watched Captain Marvel, which was the 21st movie in a 22 movie series, I looked at it, I'm like, okay, what was the intent of this film? And in my mind, I thought it was more of an indie film where you saw a woman who up to that point was being defined by other people. Captain Marvel was defined by the relationships she had with other people, and in coming to know herself, she could finally define herself by what she wanted to be. And that's how I looked upon the film. And I thought that was what a really interesting choice for a superhero film. I really liked it. No wonder that they picked the indie directors from a movie like Half Nelson. No wonder Kevin Feige did that. So I thought Captain Marvel was a really interesting movie. I didn't have a problem with it. I liked Brie Larson's performance. She's a very talented actress. I mean, she's Academy Award winning. It's really interesting to me. Like, we got an Academy Award winning actress took on a superhero movie, the 21st movie in the MCU. I was like, well, bring that on, But I understand. I mean, we have preconceived notions, and she made comments about critics, old white men. The fact is, I am an old white man, and I know that for the majority of my life, fandom, well, maybe not the majority, for about half my life, fandom was defined by old, sort of out of shape dudes. Sure, there was women in sci-fi fandom, but like the science fiction writer James Tiptree Jr. wasn't really named James Tiptree Jr. It was a woman. And she would write under that pseudonym so she could sell her work, because no one wanted to buy sci-fi from female authors unless you were like Vonda McIntyre or Joan Vinge or somebody or Marion Zimmer Bradley or something like that. But there wasn't any women in fandom. That has changed for the better. It's made all facets of fandom more interesting. You know, we have more science fiction, women writing in science fiction than ever before. We have more women making films than ever before. It's a better world for it. And it's a better world because we're going to get more diverse stories. We're going to get more interesting points of view. The idea that we should limit a person's experience, I don't get that at all. I've never understood that at all. I just don't get that. Why would you, as I've always said, I end all these chats by saying, every person you meet has a story to tell you haven't heard. All you have to do is listen. I don't mean that like you should only listen to white dudes' stories. You should listen to everybody's stories. That's the whole point, is that their life experience is a life experience you haven't had. It doesn't matter what color you are. It doesn't matter what religious background you are. It doesn't matter what your nationality is, your sexuality, whatever the hell it is, whatever you believe. I would rather listen to diverse stories from diverse backgrounds, from diverse people, than the same kind of stories from everyone. But I want the same thing from all those stories. I want the stories to be good. I want them to have integrity. I want them to be worth listening to. And unfortunately, sometimes with our franchises, commercial considerations come first. Like with Star Trek, the important thing is to try and provide a Star Trek that more and more and more people will watch than the built-in fan base, because they know the fan base is there. They already got the fan base. We're all going to tune in and watch. But they want to break free. They want to go to, as Willow pointed out, the mundanes, the people that didn't necessarily think Star Trek was for them, that Star Trek is being presented to the masses. So hopefully they can get more people to watch, which is what entertainment is all about. I get that. I just think that what's in that quest, they are changing what made Star Trek Star Trek. And in the long run, what you end up with is something that nobody is going to want to watch. That's my problem, is that these creators that are trying to change it into their own image, they don't even like Star Trek, as J.J. Abrams said, don't even like it. So what you're going to do is try and remake Star Trek more in along the lines of Star Wars or something else. And that's when I think fans get upset. And I think, look, is it worth getting upset about? I don't know. I think ultimately, if somebody makes something good, it's going to be also commercially successful. Things that aren't that good are not going to be commercially successful. I don't care what anybody says. Star Trek Discovery was a wildly expensive show. It cost a hell of a lot of money. And the stories that it delivered, if you really want to put the metrics to it and really want to examine, put on your college literature cap and look at the stories that Star Trek Discovery was telling, did those stories live up to the budget? And did those stories, they never could. And they didn't, because there's nobody at the top defining what is the proper story to tell. There's too much infighting going on. And with Game of Thrones, there's so much money involved. You had creators that I think made decisions to curtail the 7 and 8 seasons, and they had to get to the end. They had many people I think it was an impossible task. And I think for the most part, while I overall enjoyed Game of Thrones, I thought season 8 was a misstep. I'd call it a misstep. Some people didn't feel that way. But as Willow pointed out in her letter, Aragon, I was never attached to Aragon. I know some like 18-year-old kid published it. I never read the Aragon books. I saw the movie, which I thought was abysmal on many different levels, because what happens is people are second-guessing their own material. I've always thought that if you want to make a great franchise, allow the material itself to define where you're going to go. Let Star Trek define itself. It already has. Why come in and try and redefine it? I understand, because you need your marching orders are to redefine it for the modern age, but you have to redefine it unto itself. You can't just try and change Star Trek to something that it's not, or force, putting your political agenda front and center. For instance, Star Trek always was dealing with political issues and social issues. It's part of its DNA, but it did so within the context of its storytelling. And when it got too overt, too preachy, and you get Let That Be Your Last Battlefield from the third season, where you have people that are black on one side and white on the other, and the people that are white on the other side and black on the other, and there's prejudice against them, and we as an audience are looking at these literally ridiculous black and white people that are split down the middle in two. It was ludicrous, but there's certain elements of the story that are actually pretty good. But it's just silly because they made that episode about the very thing that it was heavy-handed, and Star Trek was never, well, it was heavy-handed some of the time, but the messages were inherent in the stories that they were telling. Same with the Twilight Zone. The messages were, somebody didn't come out and say, I mean, maybe they did, but it didn't come off that way. The finished product, I mean, sure, the monsters are doing Maple Street is one thing, but you watch an episode like Walking Distance, there's a lot going on in an episode like that. And it's not always, they're not banging you over the head with the meaning of the episode. They expect you to be smart enough. And by the way, I think audiences, there was a lot of intelligence presupposed on the part of audiences back in the day, whereas now I think a lot of entertainment is very dumbed down. In case you didn't get it, let's call this week's episode of the new Twilight Zone, well, not all men. But I think the problem is, rather than get angry at the creators and at your fellow fans and at the franchises, we have to try and step back and understand, okay, why is this the case? Why have these choices been made? And once you sort of have a grasp of that, the point is that we should support the kinds of media that we like. I mean, you think anybody wants to make a bad Star Wars movie? No. Everybody who's trying to make these things are trying to make it the best it can be. Weiss and Benioff were not sitting there going, we are going to piss off the entire internet with season 8 of Game of Thrones that we're spending tens of millions of dollars on every episode. They're trying to make the best show they can. They really are. Now, in the case of, say, Star Trek, they're trying to change what Star Trek is, so they're no longer constrained by the old Star Trek because there's commercial concerns all the way around. The creators want to get paid. There's no particular affinity for Star Trek, which is a mistake, because I think the best way to handle these franchises is to find people that love them. But the problem is, it's one thing to love a franchise. It's a whole nother thing to understand how to produce a television show on a weekly basis or produce a feature film. There's not a lot of people that can at that crossroads. There just aren't. And remember, Weiss and Benioff, nobody loved the Game of Thrones books more than they did. They went after those books where people a long time ago, and people were like, "That what?" They made a pilot that was rejected, and they were able to resurrect it and do another pilot. I mean, these guys loved Game of Thrones. Now everybody's all pissed. We have Game of Thrones because of them. So to be angry with them about how season 8 went is silly. You have Game of Thrones to get pissed off about in the first place because Weiss and Benioff made it so. Now, the thing about what I don't like about Star Trek is it's the new creators of Star Trek, the new stewards of the franchise, have an active disdain for what came before. They want to remake it in their own image. That I hate. Give me a Ryan Coogler. Ryan Coogler, who I talk about all the time. Ryan Coogler loved the Rocky franchise. He comes on board. He makes Creed. He makes Fruitville Station. He gets a lot of notice. He uses that notice. He uses the juice, and he's able to get Creed made. It's a perfect example of somebody who loves a franchise, takes it in a new direction, but shows how to honor it and make it commercially viable. That's a perfect example. You want to know how to deal with your franchise? Look no further than Creed. Anyway, I don't know. I've got another letter that I think I was going to read. I'm going to read it anyway. This is a long, long, long letter, and I'm going to read it. But I want to read it, because it's great. And it speaks to some of this stuff. This one comes from James Jennings, and I've read a letter of his previously, and I'm going to read this letter. And it's long, so Sit down. Let me take a drink of water so I'm not smacking my lips or making horrible noises that people can't stand. This is from James Jennings. Hi, Rob. Animation. Hi, Rob and imagination connoisseurs. Thank you for reading my letter. I arrived late, and you can imagine my surprise. I grew up watching the original series at 11 at night and watching The Next Generation in DS9 on Saturday afternoons. I hadn't heard of Voyager until its third season. When someone told me Voyager's nacelles rose up and down, I was confounded beyond belief. I was excited when Enterprise was announced. The ideas of seeing the beginnings of Starfleet was intriguing, but its execution suffered a bit. I am one of the maybe few people that enjoyed the Xindi arc. The idea of a temporal Cold War was cool, even though the time-traveling shenanigans created a slew of questions. I read the books, enjoying the stories, created my own ship and crew, wrote their stories, as you do. To say that I love Star Trek is a bit of an understatement. During Robservations live chat 129, you mentioned that Bad Robot and Secret Hideout believe that they're making the best Star Trek that has been made. Visually, yes, that is absolutely true. I thought the opening of Discovery was amazing. The galaxy transitioning to Tecumseh's eyes and his last line, "We come in peace," was awesome and gave me a sense that we were in store for some awesome Trek, people's politics aside. You have also pointed out that as the new handlers of Star Trek, they would want to make it their own. If that's the case, then why three timelines? Original, Kelvin, and now Prime. The Kelvin timeline was introduced first and later described as branching from the Prime timeline. This might have been misconstrued with as the original timeline, but the Prime timeline was introduced with Discovery. Seems confusing, right? The novels, or beta canon, seems to make the connections that it's all related to original canon as well. Characters from Discovery are mentioned, explanation of uniforms, the little details are fleshed out, connecting 40 years of established lore. Discovery has used footage from TOS in its storytelling. Axanar hybridized TOS and the Kelvin ship geometry. Yet the world building in the Prime timeline and the Kelvin timeline seem to operate off original canon, yet at the same time struggling with establishing their own world building. It's having your cake and eating it too. Considering how Trek has dealt with parallel universes, this could have been easily addressed. Since the Prime timeline consists of Discovery, the destruction of Romulus, and Star Trek Picard, which I imagine will be fleshed out in its own way when the series airs, world building in the Prime timeline is wide open to possibility, and yet empty. I really do hope that Picard ends up being an awesome show despite licensing rumors, the same struggle that new and old Trek is caught up in, and the rumor that Amazon International is already displeased with the show's direction as reported by Nerdrotic, though not confirmed. Explaining the Hobus supernova, Romulus's destruction, the birth of the Kelvin timeline, is a great opportunity to bring Star Trek full circle so that it can move forward instead of hamstringing itself. A character breakdown of supporting characters came out recently that reminds me of the fan film Star Trek Renegades. Only one way to find out, and a beloved character like Picard is a perfect way to explore that. Warm regards, keep on imagining, James. I bet you're thinking to yourself now, that wasn't such a long letter, right? Ah, but James includes a P.S. P.S. I included the article involving the olive branch to white men that I referred to in my previous letter. You had said you'd never heard of that, so I wanted to further illustrate the acid tone that conversations have been heading in since Discovery's launch. The site is newsflash.one and was published August 8th, 2018. CBS offers olive branch to white male Trekkies with Patrick Stewart reboot. CBS's small screen Star Trek revival continues. At this year's Star Trek Las Vegas convention, actor Patrick Stewart, star of Star Trek The Next Generation, henceforth TNG, made a surprise appearance to announce there was a second Star Trek series coming to CBS All Access's streaming service. Reprising his role as the wise and steady Captain Jean-Luc Picard, the new show will be a sequel set 20 years after the final TNG movie installment, 2003's Star Trek Nemesis. It's a dream come true for a generation of Star Trek fans who grew up on the rebooted concept, as well as spin-offs Deep Space Nine, and Voyager. But it also represents a retreat by CBS from the progressivism of its first series on all-access Star Trek Discovery. Though there are no public scripts as yet, Stewart confirmed the show will explore the later life of the beloved icon he spent 15 years playing. He also hinted that his character, who was the captain of the latest iteration of the USS Enterprise the last time he was on screen, might no longer be in command or even part of Starfleet. Stewart has insisted for years that he would never reprise his Star Trek role, so why the change of heart? It is reprise, isn't it? Reprise. The actor suggested the recent shift in the political and social climate helped change his mind. In a statement posted to Twitter, Stewart said he felt it was time to research and experience what comforting and reforming light he might shine in these dark times. TNG arrived in 1987 when the country's conservative turn under President Ronald Reagan was feeling more and more entrenched. The show championed liberal values, but the cast was more than 75% white and male, and the production team behind it was 100% both. With liberals feeling increasingly under attack again, a TNG reboot feels timely, perhaps even comforting. It is, in other words, the opposite of an authoritarian dystopia like The Handmaid's Tale. As a bonus, Stewart himself is openly liberal, championing women in the #MeToo era, discussing the lasting effects of domestic violence on society, and campaigning for equality for all. He is that rare A-list celebrity who remains unsullied by scandal or hypocrisy. But CBS isn't just bringing back Captain Picard because of the current political climate. It's actually one of 4 rumored Star Trek shows for the All Access channel, including a teen-oriented series which will probably resemble what already airs on its sister network, the CW. The fact that Stewart's show was announced first could be a coincidence, but it's probably not. More likely, CBS is using the nostalgic reboot to placate the white male demographic that felt alienated by the network's first Trekkie reboot, Discovery, a show which was legitimately diverse and therefore immediately controversial. Patrick Stewart on the set of Star Trek The Next Generation in 1987. Oh, there's a picture of him. A show focused on an aging white male hero known for his calm equilibrium and wisdom. It's a sharp U-turn from Discovery, which stars a diverse crew focusing on a young woman of color played by Sonequa Martin Green. After 50 years of paying lip service to equality and a future where sexism and racism were problems of the past, this new series features a cast that matches the rhetoric. The decision also dovetails with recent efforts by the franchise rival Star Wars to improve its casting diversity. Much like Lucasfilm, the producers of Discovery also found themselves running up against the same group of toxic vocal white males for whom opening the fandom in this matter was anathema. And worryingly, the show seems to already be backtracking somewhat on the initial diversity. But while Star Wars may feel free to refuse to heed the trolling masses, $1 billion or $2 at the box office will do that. Star Trek has less wiggle room. Discovery is a series designed to pull in subscribers to CBS All Access. CBS boasted this spring that the debut of Discovery drove the highest amount of subscribers to its service so far. And according to CBS TV president David Staff, the new goal is to have something Star Trek on all the time. But it seems that CBS, a network struggling with diversity problems and allegations of institutional sexism, remains committed to appealing to its older white fans. It is a frustrating dichotomy. Stewart's new series will almost certainly appeal to at least some of the holdouts who refuse to sign up for Discovery, especially when The Orville, a genteel TNG satire starring Seth MacFarlane, was free on Fox. Stewart, who is viewed as a savvy Hollywood player, hopefully has enough control over the new show to steer it in a legitimately progressive direction under the guise of a white male hero premise. Indeed, many fans want to see Star Trek continue to push forward in this arena, with some arguing shows like Discovery need to evolve further, not backtrack. One can only hope CBS hears them when it comes to this new series too. Well, that was James Jennings' entire letter. Now, here's something that I've found interesting about where fandom is at when you're talking about race and all of these issues, toxic white male fandom. One of my favorite movies of all time that also just celebrated its 40th anniversary was Dawn of the Dead. Dawn of the Dead is about 4 characters. there is a large strapping black SWAT officer, a smaller white SWAT officer, a white male a helicopter pilot, and a female. So you've got 2 white dudes, a black dude, and a female. Now, when I watched Dawn of the Dead for the first time, and I saw it when it came out in 1979, I never thought to myself, oh, well, I don't like Fran because she's a woman and Peter's a black dude, so I have a problem. No, I was watching Dawn of the Dead because those are the characters, and it became one of my favorite movies of all time. It never, ever once occurred to me about the makeup, the makeup of either the racial makeup or the sexual makeups, the makeup of the sexes, that there was 3 guys and 1 woman, or 3 white people and 1 black dude. I never thought about that. I was watching a story of 4 people that were fleeing the zombie apocalypse. They were getting out of Pittsburgh and going to try and save their lives. You know, and when I was watching Aliens or Alien in 1979, it did not bother me that the smartest person on the ship was a woman who said from the beginning, you know what, we really should keep this dude in quarantine because that's not only protocol, that's the smart thing to do. It never occurred to me at the end of Alien that, oh, a woman and her cat were the only survivors of the Nostromo. I just thought Ripley was kick-ass. I really liked her. You know, these are things that were not issues when I was growing up. When I was watching Star Trek, when you would have like in an episode like Court Martial, if they'd go to a starbase and the commander of the starbase was a black man, I never thought to myself, oh, he's black, so it's affirmative action or something like that. The thing about Star Trek was it just was. You know, when Avery Brooks took over as the captain of the commander of Terok Nor, renamed Deep Space Nine, and he had a relationship. He was a single father with his son. The first thing that struck me was not the fact that he was black on the show. As a matter of fact, they barely even addressed it until they actually dealt with racism head on directly in episodes like Far Beyond the Stars, when you went back and looked at 1950s America. I think the great stories make their point. There's no more powerful metaphor or more powerful way about dealing with things like racism by showing it as being or showing diversity through being matter of fact about it. Commander, later Captain Sisko, just happened to be a black dude, but in the 24th century, nobody cared what color you were. You're dealing with a galaxy full of all different kinds of creatures. I mean, I think that when you see a black man in James Cameron's Aliens say, doesn't matter if it's Arcturian, baby, there's a message there, you know, and real diversity is not something that needs to be stated up front. It just is. It just happens. It's the best way to tell stories. It's the best way to convey information. You know, you just show people things. You show people of all races, shapes, sizes, colors, and creeds working together. And I think that now everybody's looking for these agendas. Like if you have, I think the problem with Star Trek Discovery is not that Sonequa Martin Green is a strong, attractive black woman, and they've put her at the forefront of a Star Trek show. No, the problem with Star Trek Discovery is what they did with her character. Who cares what color she is? What's important is that she was a character that committed mutiny, and the premise of the show was to watch her climb her way back up and get herself back to where she used to be after making a horrible mistake. That's the premise of the show. That's what it was designed to be. It doesn't matter, that person could have been pink or yellow or not even a human being, and that would have still been the story to tell. But in her case, they didn't do a good job serving her character or the story they were trying to tell, because she was a perfect human being. And what they had set up in the beginning of the show, which was actually really interesting. What happens to a disgraced Starfleet officer? We saw a little bit of that in Voyager with Tom Paris. He had done something wrong, and he was in a penal colony, in Australia, or he was in I don't think they would call it that, but he was incarcerated. And part of what was going on Voyager was to watch him get himself back in the good graces. And that's a compelling story. It doesn't matter what color you are, or what your sexuality is, or your race, or whatever. What's compelling about that story is watching someone who's done something wrong, who's committed some kind of a sin and must atone for that sin and work their way back up into the good graces of society. That is a compelling story. And did Star Trek Discovery do that with the character of Michael Burnham? That's the question people should be asking. They shouldn't be angry about her race. They shouldn't be angry that she's a female. What they should be angry about is, was the story they set out to tell, was it a good story, and was it well told? That's kind of the way I think about everything I look at. And if they want to work, another problem that I have sometimes is when they put characters' traits front and center as opposed to making the characters well-rounded people. That doesn't seem right either. But that's just me. I've been babbling for over an hour. I haven't even read anybody's letters or chats or anything. I don't even know if anybody's still here. Oh, there's I guess some of you are still here. Well, that's good. Thanks for still being here. Let's see what any of you have to say. Let's get into it, shall we? Wow. Okay, here we go. Kieran Kieran McNulty says, "Cut the Snyder release, Team Whedon." That's kind of funny. Stub McShave says, "Good Omens premieres this week. I hope it's great." For those of you who don't know, I am dying to see Good Omens, based on Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman's novel of the same name. What a wonderful... It's not exactly like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, but it made me laugh the same way Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy did. The Amazon series drops on May 31st. I'm a huge Neil Gaiman fan. I cannot wait to see Good Omens. My confidence is very high. What a cast. Cannot wait. Cannot wait. Sighing Cassandra says, "It's the lack of care that gets me every time. Taking shortcuts in the storytelling is not acceptable." Well, Sighing Cassandra, one, I love the name Sighing Cassandra. What a great name. But second, yes, when storytelling is compromised if political agendas or social agendas, if they take forefront to good storytelling. Great storytelling has political agendas and sociological. It's inherently not snuck in, but baked into the story. You don't have to put your politics first and foremost. It can just be there, and that's part of what great storytelling is. Didactic storytelling is never. It never leads to good storytelling. If you're going to decide to be didactic about it, it's never good. It doesn't work. John Hiroshi says, "Why do people like Star Wars more than Star Trek?" Well, I think that I think aside from taking place in space, Star Trek and Star Wars are very, very different things. Star Trek is an allegorical action adventure show that, through the prism or the lens of a science fiction concept, they are trying to illuminate basic human truths about our world today. That's what Star Trek is all about. At its core, it has a very intellectual bent to it, whereas Star Wars is escapist fun. Nobody is trying to make a greater point. Look, broad strokes, all stories are trying to make certain greater points, but for the most part, the struggle between good and evil on a very simplistic level is shown in Star Wars. It's much easier and more palatable for people. So I think that's why people like it more. It provides more entertainment bang for the buck, and people have to think less. Star Trek is much different. You can do an episode like Measure of a Man, where the conflict is people sitting in a room talking about the fate of an android for an hour, or you can watch a rebel fleet try and blow up the Death Star. Both are valid, but one appeals more broadly than the other, I think. And that's okay. I think it's great. I love them both. I love Star Wars. I like Star Trek too, but I love Star Trek in a very different way than I love Star Wars. And I don't love them equally, but I love them both. Nay says, "Actually, I do think some writers want to get fans yelling at the screen. They take that as a sign of success." That's true. That's true. Look, when you're creating something, the most important thing, if you're creating something, anything, and don't let any creator lie to you about this. If you're a creator and you're creating media that is to be consumed by an audience, whether it's a comic, whether you've written a novel, whether you've made a movie, you want to get feedback from your audience. You want to engage your audience. Social media and the internet has made it possible. I mean, Star Trek was pioneering about many things, but Ronald Moore will tell you he was one of the first creators to get on the internet and talk to people about Star Trek. As Rick Berman famously told us, the internet was founded upon pornography and Star Trek. One you watched, the other you bitched about or you talked about, and I believe that actually. But if you make something, you want your audience to be engaged. You want to hear back from them. And yes, there's nothing more gratifying than to make something that people are watching. Even, look, the one movie I directed, Free Enterprise, there are people that think it's garbage. If you look at the IMDb, people tend to really like it or they hate it. They call it amateurish garbage. I just like that they watched it. You know, I mean, I have no problem when people say that it's terrible, they couldn't stand it or something. I really don't, but that means at least the audience was engaged somehow. And that to me is a win. It's a win. But I think you're right, because writers do want to have, hello, Gilbert. Would you like a cookie? I mean, writers do want to have, any creator wants to be engaged. They want to be engaged. And anybody that tells you that they don't is simply just not telling the truth. They're just not. Would you like to come up here? No? Come on. Oh, she's sitting. Tallulah is a very well-trained dog. She sits down, so she knows that she gets a cookie when she sits. So she can't come up. But she's here. You can hear her chewing the distance. So you're probably right about that, Nay, that ultimately that people do want to yell at their audience, because then they know that their audience is, at least they're engaging with their audience. And there's nothing better for a creator. There's nothing better than that. There's nothing better than to know that your audience is paying attention or reading your stuff. There just isn't. It's the best thing in the world. Aaron H says, I just wanted logical storytelling in season 8. If the ending George is writing in the books can't fit in one season, then change the ending. It just wasn't believable or a satisfying ending for me. Look, I agree with you. I thought the ending wasn't satisfying or believable either, but you know, that was the ending that we got, and I understand where it was coming from. And that sometimes happens with the limitations of the medium. But I'm like, you know, it didn't ruin my life. I will go back and watch Game of Thrones. It's funny, going back and just watching little clips made me realize how great that show really is. Oh my God. But I don't think you're wrong. Jared McBride says, I'm excited for the new Godzilla movie. Well, Jared McBride, I can't wait to hear what you think. You got to check back in with me and tell me what you think, because I loved it. It's great. Willow Yang says, big announcement, never been done before in the world. Rob, you're killing me. Got to get you to 50,000 subscribers. Well, you know what's funny? I could almost be halfway there if half the people that watch this channel subscribe. But, you know, I understand that they don't. And I understand people, it'll be hard. I'm fairly new to YouTube. Certainly my own channel is not the oldest channel in the world. It's only been here for 5 months. Culture Inject says, Joss Whedon's new HBO sci-fi drama, The Nevers, is filming for 9 months. Isn't that long for a 10-episode HBO show? Game of Thrones need only 6 months to film 10. Well, it's true. It depends how logistically difficult it is. It might have a lot of visual effects, but normally, like an episodic TV show like Next Generation, they would film every episode of Next Generation in 8 days. And most network television shows are not that long. So 8 days. So you figure, what is that? It depends how many episodes they're doing, but if they're complex, I mean, I know that if you watch Anson Mount talk when they were shooting Discovery, the second season, he was shooting for like 3.5 weeks to do one episode, the first episode. And that was rough. And he talked about it being rough. Stub McShave says, I think Trials and Tribulations is a perfect homage. I think so too. Trials and Tribulations is a wonderful example of how to treat Star Trek correctly. I think it was great. I mean, I who doesn't love Troubles and Tribulations? It's so good. I think so. At least I think so. Mukbang Review says, I haven't seen Creed. Was it as good as they say? Well, Mukbang Reviews, I think so. I think, look, Creed is good as far as what it is. It's I think Creed is a terrific example of taking a genre, taking a franchise and shooting it full of new energy. I think it's great. I mean, it is still a Rocky movie. It's the sixth Rocky sequel. And for being a sixth sequel, it's amazing. Captain Robert April says, frankly, Weiss and Benioff being big-time Game of Thrones fans makes what they did this season even more unforgivable. Yeah, but I would say, though, that Weiss and Benioff are trying to do the best they could do. I mean, I'd love to sit down and have a conversation with them about this and ask questions. James Gleason says the last episode of Enterprise was horrible. It was. If you watch the documentaries that I worked on for Enterprise, that are on the Enterprise Blu-rays, Brandon Braga acknowledges such. He apologizes for it. Read by Nature says, that's a BS argument. Creators can fail all the time and lose touch with the property. For example, I wouldn't let Clive Barker anywhere near Hellraiser again. These people aren't saints. Have you read the Scarlet Gospels? Did you read that book? It was interesting. Pleasant Valley Picker, California. I did it again. Pleasant Valley Picker, Canada. Why do they disrespect their customers? See, I don't think anyone's really intentionally trying to disrespect their customers. They're trying to do the best they can for whatever reason. As long, again, a lot of the time what they're trying to do is completely defined by cash, and that's always a problem. I mean, ultimately, George Lucas, when he started making Star Wars, nobody was giving him the money. He wanted to make this film, and nobody was giving him the money to make it. So his primary concern was, sure, he wanted to eventually make money, but he wanted to make the movie. His primary motivation as a creator was not the cash. He was trying to make something he thought was going to be successful, but nobody else did. And that's different. Woolev Running Happy says, Woolev Running Happy? The new business types didn't grow up with these IPs. They're disconnected and probably aren't concerned. Star Wars The Force Awakens made a ton of money, one of the worst ever. I did not like Star Wars The Force Awakens at all. I really didn't. But you're right. The new IP owners, when they buy these things, they're not buying them. They're buying them strictly for a business reason. And when they have to make more stuff, they're making more stuff in order to make more money. And usually the people look at it. It's like when anybody buys a successful business, they want to keep that business successful, and they don't necessarily always have the best interests at heart. They want the money. That's what business is. Like I said, it ain't show friends, it's show business. And if Star Wars wasn't going to make money, they never would have bought it. James Gleason says, is Discovery getting canceled or what? I have no idea. All I know about Discovery is that they announced they're doing a third season, and I have heard nothing but that. And, I read entertainment trade journals all the time, so I don't know. Vesna, Dale M, and Willow Yang are giving each other away. I don't know what's going on there. How interesting. I'd like to get in on that. Donnie Pearson says, hello again, Rob and all, and happy Memorial Day, America. I just observed a minute of silence in remembrance of the fallen. I like that. That's good. But you know what? Let's not remember only the fallen. Let's remember all our men and women in uniform all around the world that are still working for the stability of the planet and the good of all men and women everywhere. Mike G says, Mr. Burnett, did you hear the official Godzilla King of the Monsters soundtrack? Well, I saw the movie and I loved the soundtrack. I loved what Bear McCreary did. Loved it. Incredible. The Mothra theme is your favorite. I love the Mothra theme too. Let's see. Bob, I'm sorry, but this postscript is loaded with logical fallacy. If you think CBS Bad Robot is trying to advance progressivism and not co-opt it, then one needs to stop reading Facebook articles. I don't necessarily disagree with that. In my mind, what is progressivism? Progressivism is something, it is ways of being and ways of thought that help us all as a species advance. I don't understand why anybody wouldn't be progressive in the 20th century, despite all the horrors we perpetrated against one another. Life expectancy has gone up. We have less people in poverty than ever before. Does that mean there aren't still tens of millions of people, if not hundreds of millions of people in poverty? No, it doesn't mean that. They are, but we're doing better, and we should be progressing to do even better still. That's to me what progressivism means. I don't, and again, like I've always said on this channel, I believe that we can't trade one oppression for another. We have to start moving forward as a species, not as pockets of a species. We have to move forward together as a species, and we have to start thinking of ourselves as living on a planet that is a closed system when it comes to our ecology. Otherwise, we are never going to survive the 21st, much less 22nd and 23rd centuries. And I'd like to see humanity survive. I won't be here to see it, but I'd like to think that we will, because we should be going out into the stars. We should be moving out into the universe. And the only way we're going to do that is if we stop bitching about our petty differences and move forward together as a species. I don't quite know how to do that, but in my mind, that's what progressivism is. And yeah. Jeff T says Dawn of the Dead is one of my all-time favorites. First time I saw a head explode on screen, love that movie. Man, what a great head explosion that was. Cecil, brah, love that. So good. I love that movie. I love Dawn of the Dead so much. And by the way, for those of you who do love Dawn of the Dead, the UK's second sight is apparently finally getting access to the original negative elements. Richard Rubenstein, he's pulled his head out of his ass, and he's allowing a home video company, Second Sight, even though it's a boutique company, to get the original elements of Dawn of the Dead and finally make a correct home video transfer. Read by Nature says, these people don't want real diversity. They want their personal politics reflected back at them at every opportunity. I think that's true, but you know what? That's because they haven't read enough science fiction or watched enough science fiction shows to realize, or traveled enough. You know, ultimately, the human species, assuming we don't exterminate ourselves, I mean, once we get off the planet and it's like when you travel. When you travel, suddenly you try food you've never tried before and discover, oh, I really like that. I never thought I would, but I did. The more people experience the world and experience other people, they realize that, you know what, all our crazy diversity that we have, that we really should celebrate, because it's really not that much of a threat. It really isn't. As a matter of fact, it's much more fun to go to a dinner party full of a bunch of diverse people than it is to go to a dinner party full of people that are all the same. Trust me, I know. Yeah. Well, anyway, people, I think I've been yammering away for how long? Like 2 hours almost. There's a lot of people. You guys are funny. I love you guys. I love the members of the Post-Geek Singularity here. Travel does open the mind, Brad Brickley. Captain Brad Brickley, who's here. I mean, you know, yes, you got to travel. You got to go. You want to see diversity. If you really believe in diversity, and I do, travel the world, get a passport, save money. You know, I hear now, it used to be 85% of Americans don't have passports. Now it's like 65% of Americans don't have passports. 65%. That's frightening. That scares me, that we are making decisions about we're about people in the world when 65% of our population hasn't traveled. How do you know what people are like? You know, I mean, go places, eat food. Like I said on the John Campea show today, I mean, you know what? There's beautiful women of every shape, size, color, and creed all over the world, man. And there's beautiful boys too, of all kinds. And it's worth seeing. It's worth experiencing all these people. And for the most part, I haven't traveled everywhere, but I've traveled a lot of places. And one of the things that I've learned in my travels is that there are interesting people everywhere, of all different belief systems, and they're great. They're great to meet. And for the most part, I believe in humanity. I think, yeah, we can be small-minded and petty, but for the most part, we're pretty great. We're pretty great. And you know what? Let's hope that as we move forward in the future, we don't have to have many more Memorial Days. That I guess we should always remember to honor those that have fallen on this day, which we do. And there's a lot of people that are still working now tirelessly, militaries all over the world, our boys and girls in the the Air Force, Army, Navy, Marine Corps, the Coast Guard, even our boys in blue, the police, all of the people that are working to protect not just Americans, but to protect people all over the world today, back in the day, should all be remembered and honored, both for their sacrifice and their continuing work that they do. So that's what Memorial Day is all about. And I'm going to end this chat. I want to say thanks, everybody, for being here. I really appreciate the ongoing support of the channel. If you want to send me letters, I love getting letters. Send them to me at the Burnettwork.net. These chats are, of course, brought to you by Lucky Tiger men's grooming products for those men who want to look good and feel great. Now, if you want to go to getluckytiger.com, and again, I really like their stuff. I use it. You can punch in PGS for Post-Geek Singularity when you check out, and you get 20% off your entire order, which is pretty dope. So thank you all for being here on this Memorial Day. Go enjoy more food if you're still here on the Pacific Coast. If not, go to sleep. And I want to say that I cherish all of you members of this, the Post-Geek Singularity. Thanks for being here. And I'm going to say it again. Remember, every person you meet has a story to tell you have yet to hear. All you have to do is listen. And with that, boys and girls, I am, pardon me, I don't mean to misgender anyone. Boys and girls, non-binary people, aliens, however you self-identify, thanks for being here. I really appreciate it. I appreciate your ongoing support. I appreciate most of all the community we're all building together and how nice everybody is to everybody. I want to thank my moderators, Jim Boyers and Terry Flynn, who are doing a fantastic job. Love having you guys and putting the smack down when people deserve it, because I think some people do. But we'll always let them come back as long as they don't have to be, banned. So thank them, because without them, we wouldn't have such a nice community. So that's a good thing. So everyone, have a good Memorial Day. I will be back on the John Campea Show tomorrow at 9 a.m. And I'll be back here probably at 1 or 2, depending on when I get back. So thanks for being here, everyone. And again, I'll see you, assuming, we don't get hit by a weird asteroid or maybe aliens. Actually, if aliens invade, let's face it, we'd all think that was pretty cool. Even if they were murderous and were flattening our cities by the hour, it would still be kind of neat. I think it'd be kind of cool. But I hope it doesn't happen. I hope I can see you again. Anyway, I bid you farewell. And as always, have a better day.